Today on Unworthy History, we'll be reading some actual history from the following book. Texas Indian Troubles by Hilory G. Bedford. This book was published all the way back in 1905. Now today's episode is about an attack on a wagon train by some Kiowa Indians named Satanta, Satank, and Big Tree. This took place near Graham, Texas back in 1871, and it is known as the Salt Creek Massacre or the Warren Wagon Train Raid. Early in the spring of 1870, Captain Julian Fields of Mansfield in Tarrant County fitted out one of the finest mule trains I ever saw. The cattle were purchased in Missouri late in the fall before, when Captain Fields, my brother, and others were up there with cattle for the market. They were in fine condition, and wagons and harness were new and of the very best quality. There were 6 teams of 6 mules each, making in all 36 mules, and they represented a considerable sum of money. Fields and R.A. Mann had a government contract to supply the posts with both flour and grain, and could use their teams the greater part of the time in filling this contract, and the remainder of the time they expected to utilize in hauling for others. With a fine set of teamsters well armed and otherwise equipped, they started from Jacksboro, Texas in Jack County, loaded with flour for the post at Fort Griffin in Shackelford County. But when they reached a point on Salt Creek Prairie 9 miles from the present town of Graham, they were attacked by about 150 Kiowa Indians, led by their chiefs Satanta, Satank, and Big Tree. I suppose these were 3 of the most bloodthirsty villains that ever raided on our frontier. There were 2 men with each team, making 12 in all, and as well as I can remember, the train was in charge of a man named Long. Late in the evening, as the train was crossing a smooth prairie ridge, this large force of Indians made their attack. The teamsters arranged their wagons in a circle as quickly as possible, so as to protect themselves from the shots of the enemy. Being overwhelmingly outnumbered by the Indians, the teamsters were unable to repulse them for only a short time. Only 2 of them made their escape to report this terrible massacre to the commander at Fort Richardson near Jacksboro. One man who was wounded in the battle was tied to the wheel of one of the wagons and burned to death while the train was being destroyed by fire. Fortunately for the country at this time, General William Tecumsah Sherman was making a tour of inspection of all frontier posts, and not many hours before this terrible massacre passed over the very same road. This being at that time during those dark Reconstruction days of the South, when our appeals for protection by the general government were being passed wholly unheard and unheeded. It was fortunate that General Sherman had so narrowly escaped, for he would no doubt have shared a similar fate if he had only been a few hours later. He therefore could see and understand plainly from nearly a personal experience the real condition of our defenseless and suffering people, against whom the party then in power held more or less prejudice on account of the Civil War. Now one of the great leaders of the North during the Civil War, one in high authority, honest and capable as a leader, being present near the place where he could see and feel the full force of this outrage to civilization, and seeing this fine train engaged in hauling supplies to the government post destroyed, and the men cruelly murdered, could more easily understand and appreciate the importance of rendering protection. The effect was to change the whole line of policy in handling these murderers and thieves. General Sherman was at or near Fort Richardson when the men who had escaped the massacre reached home with a report, and sent Colonel MacKenzie immediately out to the place to learn all the facts concerning the massacre. Upon his return, Colonel MacKenzie reported that the account given by the men from the train was correct in every particular. General Sherman remained over at Fort Richardson one day, and there he met a committee of representative men from among the best citizens of the country, among whom may be mentioned W. W. Duke, R. J. Winters, Judge J. R. Robinson, W. M. McConnell, a former Union soldier, Peter Hart, and General H. H. Gaines. These gentlemen represented to General Sherman the exact condition of affairs on the frontier, showing how treacherous and unworthy the Indians were of the kind treatment they were receiving at the time from the general government. They showed him, too, that those who were suffering most were those who took no part nor interest in politics, but were innocent and defenseless women and children, and, as in this instance, men who were in the employ of the government. General Sherman gave this committee very close attention, and on the next day, the 19th of May, he went on to Fort Sill, in the Indian Territory, reaching there on the 21st, and remained for some time. About the 27th, as shown by a diary kept by Colonel Smythe, and quoted in Wilbarger's History of Indian Depredations in Texas, a number of Indian chiefs came into the agency at Fort Sill to draw their rations from the government, among whom were Satanta, Satank, Kicking Bird, Lone Wolf, and others. While talking with the agent Tatum, Satanta told him that he had been in a big fight, had killed a lot of teamsters, had brought in 41 fine mules that he was in command and made the fight, and that if anyone else claimed the honor, they were liars. He pointed at Satank and Big Tree as also being present, but under his command. Agent Tatum immediately reported this to General Sherman and requested that these chiefs should be punished, whereupon General Sherman sent for them, and old Satanta acknowledged that he had told the agent the facts reported to the general. But when General Sherman informed them that he would put them in confinement and send them to Texas to be tried for the crime, old Satanta, realizing the situation that he was in, began to evade the truth, saying that he was present in the fight but did not kill anyone nor take any active part in the fight in any way, but that some of his young men wanted to go on a raid, and that he went along to show them how to fight. He said, too, that the white people had killed and wounded a lot of his people, but that this would now put him back all right, and that he would now stop doing any more harm, and wanted to forget the past and begin anew. The general told him how cowardly he thought it was for 150 warriors to kill 12 teamsters who knew nothing about fighting, but if he desired a battle, that his soldiers were very ready at any time to engage with them. Being told by the general that he, Satank, and Big Tree would be sent to Texas to be tried, Satanta said that he would prefer to be shot. When Kicking Bird arose, he said that he had done all in his power to keep these young men from going to Texas to plunder, as General Grierson and his agent well knew, and he then asked General Sherman to release his friend Satanta, and that he would at once restore all the mules that they had captured. General Sherman said that he appreciated his good behavior, and that he would be well treated as long as he continued to behave, but that these men would be sent to Texas for trial. About 20 armed soldiers came up in front of the building where this council was being held, and the Indians were very much excited. Nearly every Indian had a rifle and a Colt's revolver. Old Kicking Bird continued his efforts to secure the release of the chief who had been arrested. He claimed to be friendly to the whites and would be sorry if war were the result of this affair, but if so, he would stay with his people. Now Lone Wolf came up with rifle, six-shooter, and bow and arrows, and gave the bow and arrows to one Indian who was unarmed, and the six-shooter to another. The Indian with the bow at once strung it and took it from the quiver with a handful of arrows, while Lone Wolf seated himself and cocked his rifle. Thereupon the soldiers made ready to fire upon the crowd, but Satanta and some of the others threw up their hands, crying, "No shoot! No shoot!" and the soldiers were commanded to hold their fire. Just at this moment, firing was heard outside of the fort, which was obedience to an order to let no Indian pass without further instructions. Some, attempting to pass and being halted, shot the sentinel with an arrow, and immediately the one having shot the arrow was shot and killed by the sentinel. When the excitement had subsided to some extent, General Sherman commanded the Indians to bring in the mules, which Kicking Bird agreed to do. When he went out after them, he discovered that the squaws had taken fright and left with all their animals except 8, which were taken possession of by the soldiers. All the Indians were then allowed to leave except for the prisoners, who were placed in irons and very closely guarded. Afterwards, under a strong guard commanded by Colonel MacKenzie, they were transferred to the jail at Jacksboro. On the way to Jacksboro, Satank actually gnawed the flesh from his arms, attempting thereby to free himself from the shackles, and being discovered in the attempt of killing one of the soldiers, he was shot dead on the spot. The death of Satank seemed to cause great fear among the other chiefs, so that they had no other trouble with the prisoners who were placed safely in the jail at Jacksboro, and kept in chains until their trial. It seemed at the time almost providential that General Sherman's visit should be just as these transactions were occurring, and that these cruel, bloody-handed fiends in human form were detected by him in person, as it were in the very act of perpetrating one of the most inhuman crimes, that they, through the influence of Colonel MacKenzie and the Indian agent Tatum, should be brought to justice by being placed in close confinement, and their terrible fiendish work brought abruptly to a close. A sigh of relief seemed to pass along our whole frontier. The happiness of everyone was brightened, and they esteemed life dearer, and even began to appreciate the homes and property in a higher degree than ever before, which was apparent from the improvements that were started soon after. Although the Indians came several times afterwards, they were quite different. They were never so bold again as to venture far into the settlements. They began to realize that they could not resist the influx of inhabitants into western Texas, and that soon it would be the home of the white man instead of their once happy hunting ground. The influence of General Sherman was in favor of the frontier throughout the United States, and his honest, straightforward course checked the expressions of sympathy that were being made by the northern and eastern people toward the oppressed Indian, which had only added encouragement to their efforts of robbery and fiendish murder in these sparsely settled counties. Everyone rejoiced that at last they were prisoners, and were to face the courts of the country in a fair trial for their heinous crimes. Judge Charles Soward, in whose district the crimes were committed, and under whose jurisdiction the cases were to be tried, came to Jacksboro in the following July, and the time was set for the trial of the cases against them. S.W.T. Lanham appeared for the government as prosecuting attorney, and Thomas Ball of Jacksboro and lawyer Woolfork of Weatherford appeared as attorneys for the defense, both being very able lawyers. 12 of the very best men of the country were selected as jurors. One of the teamsters who escaped the massacre, Tom Brazil, the Indian agent Tatum, and General Grierson of the United States Army were the principal witnesses for the state. During the trial, the prisoners were taken to and from the jail by a strong military guard, which was present during the whole progress of the trial, both for the protection of the civil authorities as well as the protection of the prisoners at the bar. A special effort was made by all who were participants in the trial, as well as by those who were only spectators, to have the civil law properly enforced, and great care was taken by all that the prisoners should have a fair and impartial trial before the courts of the country. I will here give the names of the jurors in the case as found in Wilbarger's History of Indian Depredations in Texas. T.W. Williams, John Cameron, Everett Johnson, H.B. Verner, Stanley Cooper, William Hensley, J.H. Brown, Peyton Lynn, Peter Hart, Dan Brown, L.P. Bunch, and James Cooley. I was personally acquainted with nearly all of these jurors, having lived in Jack County among them for quite a number of years, and I know that they were well qualified in every particular for this important service, being men above the medium for intelligence and honor. Although I was in and around Jack County during the occurrences transpiring at the trial, I hesitate to attempt to give the particulars of so important an event solely from the memory, and will therefore quote the proceedings of the court from Wilbarger's History, as they were taken from the court records. I have, in every instance where I am personally acquainted with the facts, found that Wilbarger is correct in his statements. In taking the testimony, the witnesses were very closely questioned and cross-questioned, and the attorneys for the defense took all the pains that could have been taken in defending a white man being tried under a similar charge. The attorneys for the defense both made very able speeches, presenting every phase of the case that could in any way mollify the crime or give reason to doubt their guilt. Then S.W.T. Lanham, now the present governor of Texas, one of the best of men and one of superior ability at that time, closed the trial with a strong logical speech, in which he showed a perfect chain of testimony, and that from very reliable witnesses who were not only men of prominence, but were men of strictest integrity. He then asked for a verdict in accordance with the law and the evidence. Then old Satanta was permitted to speak, which he did partly by signs and partly by words. Raising his hands with the handcuffs on them, he said, "I cannot speak with these things upon my wrists like I am a squaw. Has anything been heard from the Great Father? I have never been so near Tejana, meaning Texas, before. I look around me, I see your braves, squaws, and papooses. I have said in my heart, I will get back to my people. I will never make war upon you. I have always been friend to the white men ever since I was so high," pointing to a boy. "My tribe have taunted me and have called me a squaw because I have been the friend of the Tejana. I am suffering now for the crimes of bad Indians, of Satank, Lone Wolf, Kicking Bird, Big Bow, Eagle Heart, and if you will let me, I would go kill 3 of them with my own hand. I did not kill the Tejana. I came down Pease River as a big medicine man to doctor the braves. I am a big chief among people, and have a great influence among the warriors of my tribe. They know my voice and hear my words. If you will let me go back to my people, I will withdraw my warriors from Tejana. I will take them all across Red River, and that shall be the line between us and the paleface. I will wash out the spots of blood and make it a white land, and the Tejana may plow and drive their oxen to the banks of the Red River. But if you kill me, it will be like a spark in the prairie, making big fire burn heap." The jury was out only a short time and returned a verdict of guilty of murder in the 1st degree, and fixed his punishment at death. The whole audience gave long and loud expressions of approval at the verdict. This closed a trial of the greatest importance to Texas, as well as to the whole country that has ever occurred in any Texas court, for on it hinged the destiny of our frontier people, their homes, and their future happiness. No one properly understands, except from actual experience, the horrors of being in a continual dread of such as was threatened to the people of the frontier by these savage raids. They far exceeded the horrors of any other war, from the brutality with which these beings, clothed with the intelligence of the human, yet controlled only by the brutal instincts of the beast, could inflict death or punishment upon their captives. Having been reared to look upon life as only one of self-preservation, they found no greater joy than the torture of their enemies, nor could any appeal be made by that enemy to their sympathy or mercy. They were absolute strangers to anything like affection for others, especially for the white man, and nothing delighted them more than the torture of their captives, and the greatest suffering furnished them with their greatest delight. After the verdict, the prisoners were duly sentenced by the court to be hung on the 1st day of the following September in 1871. Tatum, the Indian agent at Fort Sill, wrote a letter to General Sherman in which he said, "Permit me to urge, independent of my conscientious scruples, against capital punishment, that as a matter of policy it would be best for the inhabitants of Texas that Satanta and Big Tree be not executed for some time, if at all, for the reason that, if they are kept as prisoners, the Indians will hope to have them released, which will be a restraining influence upon their actions. If they are executed, the Indians will be very likely to seek revenge by the wholesale slaughter of white people." Tatum also wrote to District Attorney Lanham the following letter. "In view of the trial of Satanta and Big Tree, Kiowa chiefs of this agency, permit me to remind you that the 2 characteristic traits of Indians are a fondness for revenge and a dread of confinement. From my knowledge of them, I believe that if the prisoners should be convicted of murder, it would be a more severe punishment to them to confine them for life than to execute them, and imprisonment would probably save the lives of some of the white people. If they be executed, it is more than probable that some of the other Kiowas would seek revenge in the murder of some white citizens. This is my judgment from a policy standpoint, but if we judge it from a Christian standpoint, I believe we should, in all cases, even of murder in the 1st degree, confine a person for life, and leave to God his prerogative to determine when a person has lived long enough. Judge Charles Soward, who presided as judge in the trial, also recommended the commutation of the sentence. Governor Davis, on August 2nd, issued a proclamation commuting the sentences of Satanta and Bigtree to imprisonment for life. The visit of General Sherman on his tour of inspection to the United States posts along our frontier came at a very opportune time. The Comanches and Kiowas had been gradually getting worse for some time, and it seemed as if the settlements on the frontier were about to be destroyed. Frequent appeals for the protection were made both to the state of Texas and the United States, but the state of Texas was powerless, and the United States was then trying a kind of soft peace policy which only tended to set a premium on murder and robbery. In fact, when Satanta and Bigtree returned to the agency, they made boast to the agent that they had killed those teamsters and had robbed and burned the train. They had the mules in their possession at the agency when General Sherman arrived there. The 41 fine mules were never returned to their owners, but 10 or 12 years after they were taken by the Indians, by a special act of Congress, the government gave Captain Fields a very good remuneration for the destruction of his train. It seemed that a very favorable combination of circumstances came about the time of the visit of General Sherman. Colonel MacKenzie, who, like General Sherman, was a man of undoubted integrity, was in command of the post at Jacksboro, and the combined influence of these two men, coupled with a recommendation of a good, honest Quaker agent, Mr. Tatum, was the main cause why the civil law was permitted to be enforced against these cruel murderers. General MacKenzie proceeded immediately to the task of moving these Comanches and Kiowas on to the reservation. It required considerable force to succeed in the undertaking, but once there they were readily brought into submission to his authority. I well remember how everyone who had been living about us in such terrific dread, when this end was accomplished by MacKenzie, took new courage, and ranch property soon doubled and trebled in value. People who had abandoned their homes soon returned to them, and in the short space of a few years prosperity, as a wave, swept all along our frontier, and those who had borne with such patience and fortitude the privations and trials of this terrible ordeal felt most its invigorating influence, and many of them became wealthy from the enhancement of the values of their property, and are today living in comfort, and enjoying the peace and pleasures purchased by their own suffering, as well as by the blood and tears of many noble people who had fallen victims to the arrows, lances, scalping knives, and other cruelties of these Indians. Now all we can do for them is to give them credit for what they did, and cherish their memory in a way that will show our gratitude, and perpetuate their names among the honored of the land. So that's it for this episode. Satanta was then taken to the state prison in Huntsville following the trial. He was paroled in 1873 as part of a peace treaty, but was later taken back to prison after he violated his parole by being present at the Battle of Adobe Walls. He died in 1878 by suicide by jumping out of a high prison window, although many in his tribe doubted that he took his own life. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.